Good evening, everyone. I am Chrissy Kelly of AbScent, and welcome to the 27th in our Tuesday evening webinar series. I am delighted to have Simon Gane with me this evening. He's hiding behind his black screen. I'm sure he'll be with us in a moment. And Simon, there he is, ta-da. Simon, as you probably all know by now, is an AbScent trustee. He is also ENT at the Royal National Throat, Nose and Ear Hospital, the Eastman Dental. Yeah, sorry, I just ran aground on that. Sorry about that.
It was the wrong way around to start with, and then they changed it when we moved for some reason.
Right, well, they just should never have done that. It wasn't
Exactly.
very nice.
No.
Anyway, so it's lovely to see you, Simon. As always, we haven't done this, one of these sessions with the two of us for a very long time. I'm not even sure we've been on screen together like this since pre-webinars, back when we did Facebook Live. That was always very entertaining. I would go to Simon's office and we would sit there in front of a telephone, and that was obviously filming us on Facebook Live and answer your questions. So just so that you know, Simon will be answering your questions this evening. We have taken some questions in advance, so I'll be starting with those. And if you have any other questions that come up in the course of the evening, just put them in the Q&A bar that you will find at the bottom of the screen. Please try not to use the chat bar. Using the Q&A bar is easier for me to keep track of who we've spoken to and who we haven't. So Simon, let's just get started with the first question, which I think is a really interesting one, one that's been coming up ever since I opened the very first Facebook group, and that is, why do some patients with hyposmia notice they can smell better from one nostril compared to the other nostril? So what do you think about that?
I think, okay, that's an interesting question. And you're right, a lot of people report this. In fact, some of my sort of clinical colleagues actually go so far as to test one versus the other. I think there are a couple of things going on. So your nose is divided in half all the way along for most people by the nasal septum, which is composed of cartilage and bone. And it's, in most people, a relatively flat connection all the way back. So it separates the nose into two halves. For most people, about 80% of people, there is a dynamic shifting between one side of the nose and the other about every 4 hours, something called the nasal cycle. So you swap from one side to the other, roughly in most people about 4 hours. Not everybody has this, but it is very common. And one of the things that cycle might be doing, I mean, there are a number of reasons that it might be working, but one of the things it might be doing is diverting airflow in different ways. So there's some evidence that when the shutdown side, even though it gets less overall air going through it, might be diverting more air up into the olfactory cleft. And so you might be, so you're swapping over every so often for that. And that might be why we have these fluctuating things, because of course, just because you have the lining of the nose, the olfactory mucosa that does the smelling, is in most people present on both sides, doesn't mean that it is the same on both sides. Right. So you might have a narrow, an anatomical reason, a narrower olfactory cleft, or you might have just through bad luck, more neurons have died off on one side than the other, or maybe you just got a unilateral infection. I mean, all these things are possible.
Right.
And one nose just might be worse than the other, and you might just be swapping from side to side.
And of course, it would never, or maybe I'm wrong, would it ever be possible to find out if that were the case by looking through a scope?
No, you wouldn't be able to, because even if you were, I mean, you might be able to see a relative, so not with a normal endoscope to start with. You might, if you had a special technique, be able to see a higher density of neurons on one side than the other, but you don't know how those neurons are connected.
Right,
so,
right.
So there are histological techniques. You can look in a post-mortem to see what nerves there are in a particular area, but looking in live people is much more tricky.
Right. And we don't want to take anyone's olfactory epithelium out because
Not
they
do that.
need that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. And yes, I just have to, reiterate how often people say, I know I smell better on my right side than I do on my left. So.
And I wonder whether, that, I mean, there are all sorts of things about handedness and about chirality in humans in general. And maybe it's more than just an accident. Maybe it is, the nerves on the one side, because you are right hemisphere dominant or left hemisphere dominant, you pay more attention to them. Yeah.
Right. Right. Thank you very much. Right. The second question goes like this. There are a lot of different theories about what actually causes long-term smell loss in COVID patients. Some suggest cell damage and other sources suggest brain damage. Can we ever expect an answer to what has actually happened? And if so, when? Is the research about smell loss moving faster now after COVID? And what are your predictions for the future within this field? So a couple of questions here. Let's pick them apart. And let's talk about long-term smell loss and this question about whether there is, whether it's just a question of cell damage or whether that damage is happening more centrally. So what would you like to say about that? And before you start, last week we talked, or the last time that we had the webinar like this, we talked a little bit about what is central and what is peripheral. And so it might be worth mentioning those definitions again, Simon, to help people understand where exactly the damage might be.
Sure. So when we talk about central and peripheral, we're just talking about the different parts of the sensory system. So essentially, peripheral is nose, nerves in the nose, nerves going to the olfactory bulb, and that's then central from then on up. So brain, essentially. And there's a little bit of an overlap. It's not always clear as it is in the hearing system. And you're right. When this first started, there were both theories were involved, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Just because we think one is predominant doesn't mean that you can't also get central involvement. This virus has been involved in, has been found in brain and CSF, although not that much.
Sorry, Simon, CSF?
So cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that bathes your brain.
Right.
Your brain is sitting inside your skull, wrapped in a couple of layers, and and then in a bath of this fluid. And there are, as people know, sort of neurological manifestations of COVID all over the place. So there are a couple of syndromes that have been associated with this infection. But to me, the strongest answer to this is that COVID looks like give me a couple of sidebars, a couple of caveats as usual, but it pretty much looks like our normal post-viral olfactory dysfunction. It's characterized by a lot of the same things. You get Perosmia and Phantosmia very commonly afterwards. That the recovery pattern is the same. There's a lot of overlap, and we're pretty sure that the post-viral in general is a peripheral loss of neurons, and this is supported by the more and more research we do. Of course, we can't take out people's olfactory mucosa to be certain of it, but there's a lot of evidence now mounting that it probably is primarily peripheral.
Right. Okay.
Not central. And of course, yeah, I mean, central dysfunction happens higher up because of peripheral disturbance. So it's both is the short answer.
Okay. And then the second part of this question was, is the research about smell loss moving faster now after COVID? And what are your predictions for the future in this field?
I think that's so. I'm not the only smell researcher here, Chrissy Kelly. And so I'm going to answer that, but I think you should also take a turn on this particular one, because you are in some ways even more involved than I am. But yes, certainly there's a lot more. I think everybody's just much more aware of smell disorders in general. and yes, there's a lot more research. It's a little bit, some of it's a little, to my eyes, a little bit retreading the same ground that you know, you and I have been going over for the past 5 or 10 years. It's a lot of people are sort of repeating things that we already know, but that's not a bad thing to support an evidence base. But yes, a lot of people are now interested, and a lot more interest means a lot more research. Hopefully, with some breakthroughs in treatment, if we're lucky.
Mm.
What do you think?
I mean, I can remember, you know, when the last, well, a couple of years ago, when Anosmia Awareness Day came around, and just, you know, chatting with people that were also trying to, you know, be patient advocates, and someone at Manel, and we were saying, you know, what are we going to do to raise awareness? Well, I think awareness is, yeah, awareness is now, yes, is now with us, and we don't have to worry about that anymore. You know, it's amazing to me how many people know the word anosmia.
Yeah.
And how many people know the word perosmia. I mean, that anosmia was already a hard sell, but that people actually have read the newspapers and know what perosmia is, that's an amazing thing. We really have made a lot of progress in that field. And I think the thing that demonstrated to me that we are now looking at a future where there is a lot more research comes from my Google alerts. So I've set up a number of Google alerts, and I get little things coming into my email inbox every day. And I've started getting them from kind of like financial newspapers that say things like, you know, therapeutics now, expanding fields now, you know, the latest thing, all the money is going to be put into smell disorders. So I think that if the sort of scientific, what's the word I'm looking for, therapeutics businesses are now looking at this, and I think you know, that's a good sign that there's going to be more happening on that in the future. So yes, I think we've got a lot to expect in the next couple of years. And you and I are also working on a very interesting research project on Perosmia, and hopefully we will have more in print on that soon. And as soon as we do, we will be sharing that with everyone who is on our various networks and in the Facebook group. So that's question number 2. All right, well, let's move on to the next question. This person says, I have a perforated eardrum from birth, and I wonder if ear and hearing issues have any bearing on my perosmia. I occasionally use a nose plug to introduce new foods. And this is something that people are talking about more and more. Nose plugs seem to be a really good solution for those who have really, really bad perosmia. And she says she cannot swallow with it on. Could this be to do with my perforation? What do you think about that, Simon?
That's interesting. I mean, I'd want to know. Oh, by the way, we forgot to give our standard disclaimer.
Oh yes.
Yeah. This is not medical advice. We're not. This is, and I can't really comment on any particular medical problems, but I can give a sort of general.
In general.
Yes, exactly. So there are two things. First of all, in terms of the perforated eardrum, I think that it is unlikely that that has anything to do with the perosmia, although it can have something to do with taste disturbance, which I'll come back to in a minute. The second thing is the swallowing. Yes, obviously it depends on why you can't swallow. There are many reasons why people can't swallow, but the eustachian tube, which is the drainage tube from the middle ear, so behind the eardrum to the back of the nose, it's how the middle ear fills with air. That opens and closes with swallowing usually. And so if there's a problem with that working, or it's uncomfortable to draw air through it, then I can imagine that might inhibit the swallowing process. But there are many other things that you'd obviously have to take a deep history and do the examination. So the only other thing to say is perosmia per se, in terms of smell, there's no real join there. But there is a weird thing about taste, in that taste is supplied by 3 cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are the only nerves in the body that are direct extensions of the brain. Everything else goes through the spinal column. You have 12 of them, maybe 13. And the first one is the olfactory nerve. But the taste, which is supplied to the tongue, the back of the tongue, and the tip of the epiglottis, the lid of our voice box, are supplied by 3 different nerves. And one of them, the chorda tympani, goes through the middle ear. Weirdly, it comes out the side with the nerve that moves the side of your face, and it hitchhikes along, and then goes through the middle ear, very across the eardrum at the back, around the little bones there, and then hitchhikes down on some other nerves to get to the front of your tongue. So it's again possible that disturbance of that might lead to taste disturbance, but perosmia triggered by eating, it's difficult to tease those out.
Right.
Yeah, but if it's a true sort of scent triggered perosmia, then that's not to do with that.
Right. Thank you, Simon. Okay, now this person has a question, and I'm just wondering whether they might have been confused on the terminology. They ask, I would like to know why dysgeusia can appear several months after a person has recovered from COVID. Now, I'm just wondering whether they might mean dysosmia, which is, of course, what we here in the UK refer to as perosmia. I know that dysosmia is very frequently used in the US. Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, there was a fight. My favorite word is troposmia for the same thing, which means a twisting of the sense of smell. Right. But yes, there was a sort of nomenclature fight several years ago about exactly. Right. But dysosmia to me means a more general, what we now talk about olfactory dysfunction. So
right.
Perosmia and phantosmia.
Right, right, okay. But I suppose that the question does remain, why is it that we have COVID-19, sudden loss of smell, then there's a phase of recovery that might last a couple of months, and then suddenly out of the blue, you get these sort of qualitative changes to the way you smell and taste your food. I mean, what can be said about that?
Well, I mean, this is our whole project looking at perosmia as a phenomenon. I mean, what we know is that perosmia is a characteristic of regeneration from peripheral insults. So head injury and post-infectious, post-viral olfactory dysfunction, they're the ones who really get these twisting, weird, disgusting smells instead of normal smells. So we know that it's something to do with the regeneration of these nerves from the nose. So we're very lucky we have a supply of stem cells in the nose, in the olfactory epithelium, that's usually just churning out new neurons all the time. If all of your neurons get wiped out, well, there's something about that process where the slow regeneration of these neurons, and neurons grow very slowly. I mean, we're lucky they grow at all. They don't do that anywhere else. You don't want to be growing extra bits of your brain, for instance. But in the nose, they grow very slowly back to the targets that they have in the brain, in the olfactory bulb. And our current theory is if they go in the wrong place, or they activate the wrong bit of the bulb, well, a signal coming in is maybe, say, the smell of a rose, is then the wiring is mixed up and it goes somewhere else to the smell of cloves or something else. And there's something about that we find unpleasant as well. So it's essentially because you have to wait for the regeneration before you get this dysosmia. So and the regeneration is slow. That's why it only comes late.
And that certainly was part of the picture as it was understood before COVID-19. But I still think, just from observations in the Facebook group and on the network, that this onset of these qualitative disorders, it just seems to be a little bit more haphazard than it was, than you might expect with non-COVID-19 type viruses. But well, we don't really know, I guess.
The time frame is very variable.
Yes, and of course, then you have all these fluctuations that people talk about.
Yeah.
And that is, from from a point of view of the person experiencing it, it's very stressful to have your sense of smell come back and then have it disappear again and then have it reappear. That's you know, aside from really wanting to know why that is, it would be you know, it would make it more bearable if we understood what was going on there.
And every time it goes, you're not sure whether it's coming back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Horrible.
Okay, so moving right on now to chronic rhinosinusitis. We got a couple of questions on that.
Yeah. And
wondering what the status is on NICE, which is the, what does NICE stand for? Remind us.
National Institute for Clinical Excellence. So
exactly.
NICE is the body that basically makes sure that the NHS is getting value for money. So there are thousands of drugs. Some of them work, some of them don't work, and some of them work a bit. And of the ones that work a bit, you want to make sure that if you're paying a lot of money, because new drugs are very expensive to develop, you're paying a lot of money for them, that you're getting your money's worth. And so because we are a single, a free at the point of use care service in the NHS, that falls to the body called NICE. And what happens is the drug company will take a drug, they'll say, look, we've done this study, it looks great. It's licensed by the MHRA, completely different thing, just so the the body that says, like the FDA in the States, yes, this you can sell this drug for this treatment, it works for this disease. That's different to saying what the drug company is charging for this is worth, the impact that it has on people's lives, essentially. And there's sort of complicated health economic models that they use to try and determine whether this is appropriate or not.
So the question about NICE is, has there been any update on whether or not they will approve biologics for people who have chronic rhinosinusitis?
There's no update at the moment.
No update.
I can tell you without that there are still processes involved, but there's no update at the moment. And that's a big question.
And given what's going on with COVID-19 and the fact that everyone in the health service is overworked, I mean, do you think we're looking at a couple of years before there will be a decision on this, or will a couple of months? What do you reckon?
I don't know, and it's difficult to say 100% at the moment. Okay. I have to be a little bit vague, but yes, I think it'll be a while. I think it'll be a while if it happens at all.
Right. And am I correct in thinking that people who have chronic rhinosinusitis and polyps, along with an asthma condition, that they might actually be eligible for these biologic drugs on the basis of their asthma? Is that correct?
Exactly, because asthma is number one, easy to diagnose, well, relatively easy to diagnose. Two, you have people who die from it. So that tends to, sharpen your focus a little bit. And three, has easy metrics to look at their impact on life. So you can measure how many times do people need to go to A&E, how many times do they need oral steroids, how many times do they need to take their puffers, all of those kind of things. You can count those, they're easy. And you can say, well, at that cutoff, this biologic saves this many visits to A&E and this many complications from steroid therapy and this many deaths. Well, that's easy. But unfortunately, especially for us who working in there, who have in this field, who have experience of using the biologics, because of course, if you're able to pay for the biologic, then that's fine. The NICE has nothing to do with that. But very, very few people in the world can. That's the frustrating thing, is that in CRS we can see our patients are miserable. It's I keep on saying it's like having a horrible cold every single day of your life. Blocked, runny, miserable, can't sleep, snoring, can't smell, all these things which would make your life much worse than it could otherwise be, but you can't count them. How do you, we have these ways of measuring smell, but they're clunky and inefficient, and you can't do them every day. It's nothing like, we don't have A&E visits, we don't have exacerbations or obvious exacerbation. So it's difficult for us to count these things, and if you can't count them, you can't measure them, and if you can't measure them, you can't prove that they make a big difference to people, even though we know they do.
Isn't the SNOT 22 test or checklist, isn't that what they use to kind of evaluate quality of life for people with chronic rhinosinusitis?
Yeah, and it's a very good tool, and it's been very validated, but it's not the same as this many people didn't die.
Right, right.
Very clear, measurable, simple endpoints.
Right.
It's just much easier in asthma. But if you have both, you take one drug and you get benefit on both systems.
Right.
So if you do have bad asthma, and as you know, they go together a lot, then getting the biologics that way is a very good way of doing it.
Right, right. Right, well, thank you for that. We also had a question. Gosh, we've got lots of questions now, from someone who has chronic rhinosinusitis and wanted to know sort of generally what the when they would be feeling better. I mean, that is obviously a very complex question, because it's not something that goes away immediately. So I'm assuming that this person would also be interested in knowing what's the latest on the use of biologics, if they are in fact eligible, or if they're a case of CRS.
I mean, even though biologics are not a miracle cure, that in some people they work very, very effectively. In other people, not so much. The ones that I've used. And our standard therapy is still pretty good for most people. There's a wide range of CRS between people who get polyps once they have an operation and that's it, to people who need an operation every year, and or need to be on regular steroids. So there's a huge variation, and just going to see somebody who knows what they're talking about and can assess properly and help you with that is definitely the way forward.
Right.
I might be a bit biased saying that you should see a good rhinologist, but most ENT surgeons can do the straightforward polyp surgery.
Thank you. We've got a question from Karen here. She's suffering from Perosmia, and she'd like to know why certain smells are much worse than others. For example, coffee, garlic, onions, toothpaste, and the smell of the same awful smell, all smell of the same awful smell. Well, Karen, welcome to the Perosmia show. We talk about this all the time. Karen, if you're not aware of what Simon and I are doing, we work with Dr. Jane Parker at the University of Reading. We're looking at this very question right now. And if any of you in the audience live anywhere close to Reading in the UK and would like to participate in our study, do please. I'm going to type, while Simon's answering the next question, I'll type it into the chat bar and type an email address in, and you can write to us if you're interested in participating. So Simon, why don't you briefly summarize what Jane's been doing with the different, the sort of molecular basis theory while I type into the chat bar.
I was going to make you do this. Okay, so this is actually, so Chrissy's being slightly modest there. This is all Chrissy's idea. This started with her meeting Jane, who's a food chemist, and saying exactly what you've said in the question, exactly the same. Why is it people keep telling me over and over again, coffee, garlic, toothpaste, I mean, those are the big ones, roasting meats, some preserved meats. And so Jane and Chrissy sat down and put people in front of what's called a gas chromatograph. So that is a way of separating out the molecules that come off a particular smell. So to make it reproducible, they used instant coffee made up in the same way. You make it up, and then you put it in the gas chromatograph, and it heats it up and sends the molecules through this very long tube, and then out through a sniffing port. So basically it separates all the molecules in the smell out, because most smells are multimolecular, and then you're exposed to them one at a time. And we get people who are perosmic and non-perosmic from different etiologies, different causes for their smell dysfunction, and to see what they detected, not only what they detected, but also what triggered their perosmia. and what was it? Because it was 14 out of 20. I mean, the vast majority smell coffee, especially one a particular molecule within the coffee, which is Peripheral on the Captan.
FFT.
Yeah, FFT, which is a very powerful odorant. In other words, it doesn't take much for it to switch on your nose. And this and a couple of others were the things that triggered the coffee perosmia in everyone. So there's something about this molecule, maybe a couple of others, and then some thiol molecules, which are the ones that give the stinkiness of onions or garlic, and then some other things, the pyrazines that come from roasted meats, for instance. Jane found these molecules, usually only a couple, usually quite closely related structurally, so they look very similar, and they all have this effect of triggering perosmia, and they all share their very low threshold, so they trigger smells easily. Even a couple of molecules will be in a normal smelling person you'll be able to smell them. In a perosmic, you may smell them, you may not, or they may trigger perosmia. So this was the big finding, and it comes from people like you and Chrissy noticing this pattern that really. So now we think we have a key to start unlocking why this is happening, because we can see that it depends on certain molecules. If you see, well, I mean, for me, if I see certain molecules, I think, well, what are those receptors? Because we know there's not a one-to-one correspondence, but one molecule will stimulate one of a very few number of olfactory receptors. And so you can start looking to see the identity of those neurons, because each neuron only expresses one type of these receptors, and going to see, well, what makes them special? Why are they the ones that get triggered? Is it just because they're very sensitive, so they switch on very easily, or is it something about the way they regenerate, or where they regenerate to, or where they're regenerating from, something like that? So this is the key, I think, and that's what made us very excited about this.
Yes, I must say, every time I go to Reading, go into the lab and sit there with people who are helping us with our research, it's always very, very exciting for me, and it's wonderful to see this take shape. So thank you, Simon. Right, so we now have something from Barb, who says this is her first webinar and she's just discovered the website. So welcome, Barb. I do hope that you will join us either on Facebook or on the AbScent network, which you will be able to find by going to abscent.org or going onto Facebook. We're easy to find. She says she lost her sense of smell and taste following a concussion 2 years ago. And do we have any advice other than an ENT specialist? I'm starting smell training now. So that's excellent news, Barb. I do hope that you persist with that. And if you would like more advice and some simple videos on how to smell train, do please go to abscent.org/nosewell. That is a resource that Simon and I prepared for people who have COVID-19 smell loss, but honestly, smell training is the same no matter what your problem is. So you'll find some, like I said, some simple videos on there that will help you understand how to smell train and some really important points about it, like making sure that you keep up with it twice a day for a minimum of 4 months, how to make your own smell training kit, and a couple of other tips to help you stick with it. As far as other advice besides smell training, I would say, Simon, I'm sure that you'll back me up on this, that anybody with who's had, a TBI really needs to think about their eating. Pardon?
TBI?
Yeah, TBI.
Traumatic, you mean traumatic brain injury?
I do. I meant traumatic brain injury, yes.
Subtitles, yeah.
Yes. So that Barb would want to be thinking about her food to make sure she's getting a good enough diet. And that would mean bringing in lots of textures, variation in true taste. So always having a good balance of salty, sweet, sour, bitter, savory when, on your plate when you're thinking about, creating a menu. So do think about that. We do have information on that, Barb, which you will probably find a broader, well, we certainly do more with food in the AbScent network. And when Simon is answering the next question, I will hustle over to the network and get you a link, and I'll put that in the chat bar as well.
So a couple of things. One thing that you taught me, Chrissy, is with your experience with people with TBI, is that they can take a little longer than people post-virally, but they can, if they persevere, they can get good improvement with the smell training. There's something about their recovery that seems to take longer and happen later.
Yep.
Yep. And that's a really good point. The other thing is, I'm always cautious, again, not medical advice, but being assessed by somebody who knows how to assess a smell disorder is very important. There may be a clear diagnosis of traumatic brain injury, but if it's not clear, there are other more serious causes of smell loss, and those need to be excluded.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me while I just pop that into the chat bar. Right, thank you very much. Great. All right. Now, Judith has asked, how is it that Dr. Fauci and others internationally leave Perosmia and other post-viral smell disorders out of the long COVID language and funding? It's a very good question. I've got some thoughts on this. How can we best ensure that this gets a voice with those leading the charge in bringing attention and funding for this? So Simon, let's first talk about, is Perosmia a long COVID symptom?
I mean, yes, obviously, isn't it? I mean, again, so if on the face of it, if you're looking at neurological, if you just want to limit it to just neurological sequelae of COVID infection as your long COVID, then of course Perosmia is. Just because we knew what it was and diagnosed it before doesn't mean that it's not part of the syndrome. And luckily for us, at least, our funding at UCLH for long COVID is including our smell services. So where I work at University College London, that is actually funding some of our work there. But you're right. I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But again, as before COVID hits, as I always say, no one cares about smell until they lose it. It's just another example to me.
You see, I worry that Perosmia is less an ongoing, I mean, when we think about long COVID symptoms, we think about people who are continuing to have brain fog and fevers and things like that, which for me seem to be sort of active, ongoing things. Whereas Perosmia is really an indication that there's been damage, the first, in the active phase of the virus, and now that damage is left behind. It's like the cast on the broken leg that just reminds you that there's been some damage in the past.
Yeah,
and for that reason, it's been excluded from the list. Now, I'm kind of with you on this, and the person that asked the question, and your name has just escaped me, that it should be included, but I had always assumed that was why it was left off the list of long COVID symptoms.
Of course, that explanation of why it doesn't actually hold up, because I mean, there are many theories of, for instance, this post-viral myalgia, yuppie flu, chronic fatigue syndromes. One of them is that it is just what's called the central regulator theory. So the theory is that your brain has a part of it that's supposed to predict energy use and drive you to conserve it. So it tells you you're tired way before you are actually tired, because you might need that energy later on. So this is so there's some part of your brain that's basically guessing how much energy you have and how much energy you're going to use, and tries to sort of regulate that in some way. And something about the viral infection resets that, so it guesses that you're running out of resources way too early. It tells you you're tired before you're actually depleting your energy physically. And that's why these people are just tired all the time. They sleep for 20 hours, get up and go back to bed almost immediately, because there is something that's broken that isn't working properly, and now you're living with this long-term effects. It's exactly the same as Perosmia. You've broken the network of connections that result in a normal sense of smell, and now you're left with the sequelae afterwards. So I would say that it has to be part of the long COVID.
Interesting. Well,
it's just nobody cares about smell.
Right. Well, then let me add that to the list of things that I will that I'll do in the next couple of months. Is I mean, I do keep seeing that come up and think to myself, I actually approached the APPG, which is the All Party Parliamentary Group on long COVID, and said, I'm the founder of a charity. We've got all these people in our Facebook groups. We would like to know why smell loss has not been included in your in the things that you're discussing. That obviously they published that. Never heard anything. So perhaps it's time to go back to them and make some noise. Make some noise.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got another question here. What are your opinions on whether allergies, dust, cats, dogs, pollen, can cause anosmia? I've heard wild disagreement from ENTs and allergists.
Yeah. So as usual, I think it's both. So the simplest answer is that many ENTs, myself included, use smell as a very quick, if they think about smell at all, they use it a very quick differentiator between allergic rhinitis and chronic rhinosinusitis. So allergic rhinitis is hay fever, but most people think of hay fever as just something you get in spring with the pollen, but that is just if you're allergic to pollen. So depending on what you're allergic to, you have a different sort of annual pattern. If you're allergic to house dust mite, like I am, you're pretty much allergic all the year round, maybe worse in winter with central heating, etc., better in dry, warm climates. If you're allergic to just grass pollen, then your bad time is coming up right about now. Trees a little earlier, dogs only if you're exposed, things like that. So that's allergic rhinitis. And usually in the mild to moderate disease with allergic rhinitis, the smell is generally preserved. Generally people, it doesn't bother them. But in chronic rhinosinusitis, which is also an inflammatory disease in the nose, but is a lot more, there's inflammation within the olfactory cleft and the olfactory mucosa. It's much more common to have smell loss. So that's where the disagreement then comes, because in allergic rhinitis you can still get a completely blocked nose. You can still get the olfactory clefts closed up. There is this thing called the eosinophilic cationic protein, which is part of the allergic rhinitis reaction, which we know is not good for the olfactory mucosa. So there can be a direct effect on that as well. So the short answer is usually allergic rhinitis, your sense of smell is preserved, especially if it's treated, but not always. And distinguishing between the two can sometimes be difficult, but it is important to get it right. Yeah, and it's not, as with most things in life, it's not clear.
Right.
You need to put the whole picture together. But if somebody came with a blocked runny nose and lost their sense of smell, I'd be much more likely to consider them to be chronic rhinosinusitis rather than allergic rhinitis. Luckily, the treatment for the two is very similar at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Amy has asked, she's been smell training for over 5 months. Do you recommend adding new oils or stay with the same ones? I would definitely change things up, Amy. There's nothing magic about the original 4 as far as we know. We only have evidence base for the original 4 scents that were used in Professor Hummel's studies, but that doesn't mean the other ones aren't any good. So do change. She has another question though, and she wants to know, will most people going through recovery, and I assume she means from COVID-19, suffer from Perosmia, or could there be full recovery without that stage?
Those are 2 different questions in a way. So do most people suffer from Perosmia? I don't think so. I think that Perosmia is so the smell loss in COVID is quite common. By far, the majority of this is just a blocked nose that resolves almost immediately. a subsection of those then go on to develop this the more long-standing post-viral olfactory loss, and then a subsection of those develop Perosmia and Phantosmia to a certain, and felt and smell locks and other things. What was the second one? It was what was the part of the amount of recovery, and what was the other bit?
Oh, I do apologize because I've already dismissed it.
Sorry.
Taken it from the list.
Sorry, you can re-add it.
All right.
Yes.
Yes, sorry about that. Christina says, are there any steps to prevent anosmia and perosmia from worsening? I've had post-COVID anosmia since December, but I'm now experiencing increasing perosmia. Apologies if this has been discussed before. This is my first webinar. Oh, Christina, I'm so sorry. And anyone who's sitting at home now listening to this, who's had perosmia, knows the misery it can cause. I wish I could say that there was a way of making it stop, but as far as I know, there isn't. And Simon, what would you like to add?
I mean, again, I don't want to go against your experience because you have been through it, as have a lot of people in this webinar. I mean, generally, we expect it to become less severe. That's not always the case, for sure, less impactful. And there are definitely strategies on the website and in the forums about ameliorating its effects. And we also know you talked to Thomas Hummel a couple of webinars ago about possible other treatments, medical treatments that are coming on. But my belief is that generally most healthy nerve systems and other physiological systems are homeostatic. They like to get back to a normal plateau, and that I think I'm right in saying, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that for most people the perosmia, it can worsen, but it does improve as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in the beginning, in an acute phase,
yeah.
It is really, really difficult to live with. But then once you've passed through the acute phase, then things seem to steadily improve. So unless of course you're experiencing fluctuations, and that can be very distressing, as we said at the beginning of the webinar.
Yeah.
But
there are things you can do, safe foods, cinnamon toothpaste, recognize your triggers, the nose plugs. Just talking to people about it can be very helpful, and doing things like this, realizing that you're not alone.
Yeah.
And there's a wealth of patient expertise on the Mighty Networks, AbScent Network, and Facebook groups about people who've been through the same thing, who can give tips and tricks.
Yeah, yeah. And it does help to know that you're not the only one, you know, and that's such a common comment in the Facebook groups and in the network. Someone will come in with a story of, really misery, and then a whole lot of people will pile in and say, oh, it was just like that for me, and I'm okay now. And I think that, such an important message to tell everyone who is listening to this, that, for the vast majority, things do improve eventually. Unfortunately, the pandemic is still only 14 months old. 15 months old, and we know that perosmia can take up to 2 years to really get back from completely, and most people much faster than that. 2 years is sort of the outside limit of a long recovery period. So I still think that we're kind of in the middle of watching things happen in real time. And there's still lots and lots of reason to be positive about what people's outcomes will be. So Christina, I hope that makes you feel a bit better.
Watch the webinar with Thomas and see somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Good. Okay. Oh my goodness, we've got 18 questions piling up here. So, has anyone else said that if they drink alcohol, it heightens the smell disturbance and makes it worse in the days following it? I've heard a couple of comments like that, but nothing where I've seen a real pattern. I know people have mentioned alcohol a couple of times, but it doesn't stick it out in my mind as being something that where I keep hearing the same story over and over again. Have you heard anything, Simon?
No, I mean, the role of alcohol in noses is quite complex. There are a couple of things that can be going on, but yeah, not particularly.
Okay. Let's see. Karen has asked the same question about changing up the smell training smells. And I would say yes, change up.
We can't say for certain because there's no evidence for it, but it just makes sense. And there's nothing wrong with change, not just changing up, but just increasing your palate.
Right.
To see, what other things are you interested in smelling or learning to smell or missing.
And she's asked about, would it be useful to smell train with things that are disgusting? Put the
triggers or
pushing the pushing through theory of getting over Perosmia. Hard to say. There's no one's ever done a study on it, so I don't know what to tell you, Karen. I certainly wouldn't do it if it was making you feel sick to your stomach. No, there's no reason to do that.
What about your experience with coffee, Chrissy?
Well, I just couldn't stomach coffee. And then I thought, I really miss drinking coffee. And so I just started drinking it. And I just got used to it. And now when I open up the jar of coffee in the morning and put my nose in, it's just a lovely smell. So I always say I feel like my brain's filled in the blanks somewhere along the way. And
yeah, it's an N of 1 study, but it does suggest that training with these things might actually work.
And I even drink my coffee black, which I didn't used to do. I really enjoy the bitterness of it on my tongue, when especially if I'm eating something sweet for breakfast, which sometimes I do. Okay. Bev's got an interesting question. I've read that the olfactory nerves destroy themselves to protect the brain from the coronavirus. Is that correct? It's the wording maybe not quite right, but there is something sort of like that. Is that not right? Apoptosis?
Yes. Is that induced apoptosis? I mean, do we know that's okay? So number one, we're still pretty sure that the nerves themselves don't get infected by the virus. I think that's been shown in several different studies. They don't express this ACE2 receptor and the TMP RSS enzyme on their cell surface. And I was reading a paper just a couple of weeks ago that basically recapitulated this in mice. So the infection to the nerves may not be happening, but the sustentacular cells, the supporting cells, they do express all of these things and they do get infected. But so apoptosis means programmed cell death. In other words, so you tell cells to die for certain reasons, that usually they're expressing aberrant proteins that mean they're infected, they're expressing viral proteins, so they're making more viruses, or they're cancers or things like that. So in that way, so to answer the question, I'm not sure that I've not seen anything about the olfactory sensory neurons themselves undergoing apoptosis as a protective measure, but that is a standard measure of dealing with viral infection, and that maybe the sustentacular cells are doing that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Chrissy.
I know that there was a new article came out today that I saw. So we're not, we may be up to date, everyone, but we're not that up to date. So we haven't quite finished today's reading. Yeah, I
had an excuse.
I think that that's what, getting back to Bev and the question about nerves dying, I think that covers it. Okay. Let's see. I would like to know about effects of anesthesia for those patients with Perosmia and hyposmia. I've heard of patients losing smell and taste again or getting worse after sedation. Thank you. So what do you have to say about that? This is a subject that interests me greatly.
There definitely, yeah, there are definitely case reports of this, of more than one, of changes in smell function. Unfortunately, not usually improvements with anesthesia. I mean, anesthesia is not just drifting off to sleep. You give quite a few drugs that change the way the body behaves, including the heart rate, the tonicity of the blood vessels. So in other words, you mess with the blood supply. And if you mess with the blood supply to somewhere that's already on the edge of being able to work properly, then you can imagine that might, especially in a prolonged operation, that might mean death of those cells or death of certain parts. And so it's definitely recognized. I think the chances are vanishingly rare. It's not, we don't put it on any of the consent forms when we're talking about doing an operation, because unless they're doing sinus surgery or something near the olfactory cleft, but generally it's not a big risk factor, but it does happen. But so do lots of other horrible things.
Yeah.
Don't have an operation unless you need to.
No. Are there any medications that can assist with the recovery of Perosmia? So I think we've covered that one already. Nasal sprays, Coldestop, Vicks Defense Spray, which have been mentioned by sufferers on the AbScent site. None of those things will actually affect the Perosmia, unfortunately.
I mean, so the reason we like vitamin A is because we think it might be a signal for regeneration. So maybe over a longer term, but we've not really looked at that.
We're running out of time. It's just incredible. But here's a very interesting question. Why does the power of smell decrease? I mean that when I try to inhale something, for example, cinnamon, I feel this smell, but with each next breath, the smell gets weaker. And for 5 or 7 breaths, it disappears completely. So I think this is something that we hear a lot. This is something that Simon and I and Jane in our research have also looked at. And the AbScent website has a questionnaire in it, which when we're looking at the results of that questionnaire right now, we've got some really interesting results on it. And I think that we will know more about this, the way the sense of smell kind of gets tired very quickly when it's recovering.
Well, in general, I mean, even in anosmia,
that's true.
There is habituation all the way through. So it's called habituation because you don't, sense of smell seems to be, well, as most sensory systems are, it's concerned with novelty. You don't want, if you're getting all of the inputs all of the time, there's just too much to deal with, too much to process. So you have to have a way of picking out salient features in whatever you're trying to detect. So if you're trying to look at things, if you're trying to hear things, if you're trying to smell things. And one of the way you do that is by just ignoring stuff that doesn't change. So, and this is called habituation in vision, in hearing, and in smell. Because weirdly, this is also how video compression is done. You really only look for the bits, you really only bother encoding the bits that are changing. Static background, like behind me, you can represent very easily by just saying, oh, this bit doesn't change. And so it's the same in noses. But there's something about losing your sense of smell which changes habituation, which is quite interesting to us. And it seems to shut down a lot more quickly. So although my relatively poor but still functional sense of smell, that cinnamon will go down, but I'll still probably get a little bit of a signal every time. Someone else's who's post-viral, for instance, they might only get 1 or 2 hits and then it's gone.
Right. Yeah. Well,
I certainly
can relate to that. I am very sorry to say that even with 11 more questions in the question and answer bar, I'm afraid we've reached the end of the hour. I know Simon will be coming back to do this again, so we'll look forward to seeing you then, Simon. And in 2 weeks, I will be here with Professor Claire Hopkins. We will be talking about 2 recently published papers that will be of interest to people in the AbScent groups. So until then, I'd like to say thank you very much, Simon, and we will see you in 2 weeks. But good night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Simon. Good night.
Good night.